Welcome back to the Law&Crime Network, everybody. This is Jesse Weber. Well, you just heard the closing arguments put forth by the prosecution in the Todd Kendhammer case out of Wisconsin. I'm joined by former federal prosecutor Kendall Coffey. Kendall, you just heard the closing arguments by the prosecution. I thought they did a pretty good job. What did you think?
He did a very good job. His tone was confident, persistent, but not excited, agitated. He just very calmly went through the evidence and bit by bit by bit eliminated, it would seem, virtually all of the items that could have helped the defendant. He did a brief attack on each of the defense experts, but it was good. You know, he found a big hole with each of them and moved on. He didn't give us paragraphs and paragraphs because, again, it was a confident closing argument that says basically, look, we're all here. We know why we're here. Let me go through their reasons, but this is a desperate defendant who's simply not telling you the truth, and he doesn't wave his hands and doesn't have to yell or exclaim in order to get the point across. With respect to the family members, he treated them somewhat sympathetically, but said, of course, that's why they're not serving on juries. They are not the objective fact witnesses that can help you decide this case. I still wasn't convinced that he had an overwhelmingly clear case of motive, but as he pointed out, you don't have to prove motive in a murder case.
You know what, Kendall? I'm sorry to interrupt there. We actually do have more activity going on in the courtroom, so stand by. We'll be back here with more analysis, but let's turn to the courtroom.
Okay, great.
All right, welcome back, everybody. It was just a little bit of activity in the courtroom, but I'm back here with former federal prosecutor Kendall Coffey talking about the prosecution's closing arguments. Kendall, I'm sorry I had to interrupt you before. I just thought it was you were talking about what you thought maybe he didn't do a great job of convincing the jury about. What were your thoughts on that?
Well, he made an overwhelming case, but the issue that isn't quite so strong for the prosecution is the issue of motive. And as he pointed out, you don't need to prove motive in a murder case. It's commonly believed that motive is the most important thing to prove. What you have to prove is that the homicide was convicted with intentionality. And usually, if there's an intention to kill somebody, common sense tells us there's a motive behind that intention. But strictly speaking, you don't have to prove a particular motive. And as he alluded to, sometimes you just never know what's going on inside of people. That being said, what I think the defense has to do, and they've got a very tall hill to climb, what the defense has to do is come back to that issue of motive in a couple ways. First of all, if in fact he was taking his wife on a different irregular route, sort of a road to nowhere, then that suggests, rather than a rage killing, that it was planned out and premeditated, because why else would he be taking her on this strange detour on a side road? Is it a planned and premeditated murder, in which case that's consistent with the finding the side road theory, or is it, as he also tried to suggest, a rage killing? Just something happens, something snapped during the course of that drive, and he went from good husband to brutal. So that, what I would suggest, is kind of an inconsistency in why this killing happened. That, I think, is something that the defense will have to try to exploit, because with respect to the actual evidence of witnesses, with respect to even some of the expert testimony, the defense has a very, very tough time. If the prosecution had an airtight motive in this case, I think it would be virtually hopeless for the defense. But there is that little bit of room that the defense has to try to work and find a reasonable doubt.
Yeah, see, I think it's interesting the fact that he said, look, you don't know what happens in people's minds. You can't look from the outside in at people's marriages, and people get divorced, people cheat on each other, people are sick. You don't know what goes on. So it's not fair. We're not going to present a motive because we really don't know what was going on through Todd Kendhammer's head. And as you said, I thought they did a very effective job of analyzing what makes sense. I think this really is an interesting case about common sense. What would make more sense in this case? Would it be an accident, or does something seem a little bit more nefarious? A little bit. For the jurors here, what the defense is putting forward that there might have been an accident or that there was an accident, it seems that it could be possible. But what is the difference between something being possible and something being reasonable? You know, what's the difference between something being possible and reasonable doubt? Is it possible that there could have been a car accident? Is it possible that she was going to be late on the same day that this accident occurred and she'd never been late before? Is it possible he really was going to someone's house who didn't know where they lived, they didn't know he was showing up? Is it possible that he was conducting CPR for a long amount of time and that, he could have had more of a chance to call 911? Is all of this possible, or is it not reasonable? Can you explain that dichotomy, that little difference for our viewers?
Well, and that dichotomy that you just described is the whole key, but in many times between guilt and innocence, because as the judge instructs the jury, reasonable doubt doesn't mean something fanciful. It doesn't mean something that's merely possible. There's all kinds of possibilities, and as we talked about, almost everything is possible. We could be living in parallel universes for all we know. But the jury is required to, especially in a case like this, have a doubt if they're to acquit that is reasonable. It's got to be based on something more concrete. And that is why I think the prosecutor was very skillful and basically establishing that none of the defense explanations were reasonable, that they were all very, very remote. I mean, even just starting off with the idea that a pipe flies off a flatbed truck that, as the prosecution pointed out, has not really been verified in any way, shape, or form, explodes into the windshield and commits and is the instrument of a brutal death. Starting out, that sounds like really, really improbable. I mean, like a 1 in a million or a 1 in a 10 million event.
Right.
And then when you add the other elements that the defendant necessarily says had to have happened for him to be innocent, it just becomes more difficult. So the jury may struggle with the case, as I suggest, on the motive issue, because even though they don't have to ever know why, and even though the prosecutor very effectively pointed out that sometimes you never know what's inside people, nevertheless, when we see something brutal, when we see something horrible happen in this world, I think the word why is the first and often the last question that burns into our minds and hearts, and we just want to know, why did it happen?
Right, I agree with you, and I think sometimes in this case specifically, we do have more questions than we do have answers. Kendall Coffey, thank you so much for joining us today. I know you have to take off. We really appreciate your analysis, and we can't wait to have you back on the program to talk about more cases we'll cover here.
Well, thanks so much for including me. I'll be fascinated to see how this turns out.
As we will, as we will too, because the defense will be presenting their closing arguments after this short break. I do want to play for our viewers right now the continuation of that cross-examination of Todd Kendhammer, again, where the prosecution really jumped on him, and you heard it in the closing arguments, that his story just didn't make sense. And in the end of the day, that's what the jury's going to have to decide, whether or not his story made sense. But now, let's have you take a look and you make a decision.